The jungle is silent now. New Britain, October 1944. The air is a thick, wet cloth, heavy with the scent of decay. In damp earth, a Japanese infantryman, Sergeant Kiyoshi Agawa, crouches in a makeshift dugout. His uniform, once a symbol of imperial pride, hangs in tattered rags. From his emaciated frame, his eyes are fixed on the horizon, where the American fleet is a mere smudge of smoke. But his attention is not on the warships, it is on the empty sea between them, the sea, where no Japanese supply ship has been seen for weeks. His stomach is a hollowed-out knot. The daily ration of moldy rice is a memory, now. They boil leather straps, scavenge for grubs, and chew on roots that sometimes bring on crippling pain. The boastful war songs of 1942 are a ghostly echo. The doctrine of Yamato Damasha, the invincible Japanese spirit, is being tested not by American bullets but by a far more ancient and relentless enemy. He watches a flight of distant B-29s, silver specks against the vast blue, flying north. Towards the heart of his empire, he does not know their precise mission, but he understands their message. The war has transformed. It is no longer a battle for islands, but a fight for the very sustenance of life. This silent, invisible noose was the U.S. Navy's Blockade, a strategic masterstroke that would systematically dismantle the Japanese war machine and challenge the core of its soldiers' famed endurance. To understand the profound shock of the American blockade, one must first comprehend the scale and speed of the empire it sought to strangle. Japan's ascent was not a gradual expansion, but a violent explosion across the map of the Pacific. In the decade leading to Pearl Harbor, a potent cocktail of ultranationalism, militarism, and a perceived destiny for Asian hegemony fueled the ambitions of the imperial Japanese state. The concept of Hakko Ikkyu, the 8 corners of the world under one roof, provided a divine mandate for conquest. The nation, still reeling from the perceived insults of Western naval treaties and economic pressures, saw war as an inevitable clash for survival and dominance. Its military, particularly the Imperial Japanese Navy (IJN), had spent decades preparing for a single, decisive confrontation, concept known as Kantai-Kessen. This doctrine envisioned a climactic battleship engagement that would destroy the American fleet as it advanced across the Pacific, forcing a negotiated peace. It was a plan built for a short, sharp war. It completely failed to account for a long, grinding war of industrial attrition. The opening moves of that war, however, were nothing short of spectacular. December 7, 1941, a date that broadcast Japanese naval air power to a stunned world. The attack on Pearl Harbor was a tactical masterpiece, crippling the U.S. Pacific Fleet's battle line. Simultaneously, across an ocean expanse larger than the Roman Empire at its peak, Japanese forces struck. Hong Kong fell, the Philippines were invaded, the British bastion of Singapore, once deemed impregnable, surrendered in February 1942, its 80,000-strong garrison. Humiliated, the Dutch East Indies, with their vital oil fields, were overrun by March. The resource-rich territories of Southeast Asia, sources of oil, rubber, tin, and rice, were now firmly in Japanese hands, linked by a web of sea lanes to the factories and cities of the home islands. This new empire was christened the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, a grand euphemism for a ruthless occupation designed to fuel the Japanese war machine. For the Japanese soldier and sailor, this period of unchecked victory forged an unshakable belief in their own superiority and spiritual fortitude. They had defeated Western colonial powers with breathtaking speed, the myth of Japanese invincibility, underpinned by the code of Bushido, which emphasized honor, duty, and death before surrender, seemed a tangible reality. They believed their spirit, their Yamato Damasha, could overcome any material disadvantage. They boasted of their ability to endure unimaginable hardship, a belief that would soon be put to the ultimate test. But even in these triumphant early months, a fatal flaw was embedded in their grand strategy. The empire was a sprawling maritime organism, utterly dependent on the sea for its lifeblood, and across the Pacific, the United States was awakening, not with a spirit of resigned defense, but with the cold, determined fury of an industrial colossus. This first part of the context establishes the peak of Japanese power and the ideological foundation of their soldiers' endurance. The scene is set for the American response. While Japanese forces consolidated their new empire, the United States initiated a war. Plan that seemed at first to play directly into Tokyo's hands, the American public end. Military command thirsted for vengeance for Pearl Harbor and the path to Tokyo as dictated by General Douglas MacArthur and Admiral Chester Nimitz, was one of island hopping. This strategy, seizing key islands while bypassing and isolating others, would capture advanced air and naval bases, stepping stones for the eventual invasion of Japan itself. The names of these battles would become synonymous with savage, close quarters combat. Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Saipan, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. In each, the world witnessed the terrifying reality of the Japanese soldiers' willingness to die. Banzai charges fought with swords and bayonets became a hallmark of their tactical doctrine, a brutal spectacle of human wave attacks that often ended in near-total annihilation. To the American Marines and soldiers on the ground, it appeared the enemy had a fanatical disregard for life itself. This perception reinforced the Japanese military's own propaganda. They believed their superior fighting spirit could inflict such catastrophic casualties on the Americans that their political will would shatter. They were prepared to trade blood for time and territory, confident in their endurance. Yet even as these iconic land battles captured headlines, a quieter, more systematic war was being waged beneath the waves and across the vast expanse of the ocean. The U.S. Navy, and in particular its submarine force, was initiating a campaign that would strike at the very foundation of Japan's war-making capacity. This was the war on shipping, an economic blockade on a continental scale. The architect of this overarching strategy was Admiral Ernest J. King, the formidable and ruthless chief of naval operations. King understood that Japan was not a self-sufficient land power like Germany or the Soviet Union. It was an island nation, an industrial state, built on imported raw materials. Its economy was a fragile, complex mechanism that ran on imported oil, coking coal, bauxite, rubber, and food. Sever those maritime arteries, and the entire organism would begin to starve. The tool for this task was the U.S. submarine fleet, initially hampered by defective torpedoes, a scandal that took over a year to rectify. American submariners, once equipped with reliable weapons, became the silent hunters of the Pacific, operating from advanced bases like Pearl Harbor, Fremantle in Australia, and later, the captured islands of Majuro and Guam. They penetrated the very heart of Japan's inner zone. They lurked in the strategic choke points, the Luzon Strait, the South China Sea, the waters off Formosa, and the home islands themselves. Their targets were not just warships, but the mundane, vital merchant vessels of the Nippon Yusen Kaisha and other shipping lines, tankers carrying oil from the East Indies, freighters laden with rice from Indochina, or carriers from Malaya. This was the unglamorous yet war-winning work of economic strangulation. It was a campaign that directly targeted the Japanese soldier's boast of endurance, not by confronting his spirit, but by emptying his stomach and draining his fuel tanks. The stage was now set for a confrontation not of armies, but of logistics versus willpower. The context is now complete, having established both the zenith of Japanese expansion and the American strategic response that would target its logistical core. The narrative is poised to delve into the specific facets of this confrontation. The clash between American material power and Japanese spiritual faith was not a single battle but a multi-fronted siege. To understand its full impact, we must view it from several distinct angles, each a critical facet of the same devastating gem. At the heart of the Imperial Japanese Army's ethos was an unshakable belief in the supremacy of the human spirit over material strength. This was codified in the Senjinkan, the Field Service Code, issued in 1941, which stated unequivocally, "Do not suffer the shame of being taken alive. Die to ensure that you do not leave behind a blemished name." Surrender was the ultimate dishonor. Endurance of hardship was not just a military necessity, it was a spiritual discipline. This philosophy, often encapsulated by the term Yamato Damasha, the Japanese spirit, was drilled into every soldier from the moment he enlisted. He was taught that his willpower could overcome starvation, disease, and overwhelming firepower. Logistics were almost a secondary concern. The belief was that a force with superior morale could live off the land, fight with minimal supplies, and triumph through sheer force of will. This created a military culture that often neglected the mundane science of supply. Favor of the glorious art of the attack. When faced with shortages, officers would exhort their men to endure the unendurable, viewing hunger as a test of their purity and commitment. This ideological framework left them psychologically and practically unprepared for a systematic, industrial-scale blockade that would render their individual endurance irrelevant. In stark contrast to Japan's spiritual focus, the American approach was one of cold, clinical calculation. The U.S. Navy's war instructions, updated just before the war, explicitly authorized unrestricted submarine warfare against Japanese shipping. This was a deliberate decision to target the enemy's economic lifeline, a lesson some historians argue was learned from the British blockade of Germany in World War I and from Japan's own vulnerability. The American submarine campaign was a masterclass in strategic execution. Submarines, like the Gato and Ballo-class boats, were long-range, rugged, and increasingly well equipped with radar, which allowed them to hunt effectively in poor weather and at night. Commanded by aggressive, skilled skippers, Wolfpacks would coordinate attacks on convoys sinking hundreds of thousands of tons of shipping per month. Their primary hunting grounds were the narrow sea lanes connecting Japan to its conquered territories. By late 1944, the map of Japanese merchant losses resembled a tightening noose. The success of this campaign was not an accident. It was the result of a clear-eyed strategy that identified and relentlessly attacked the enemy's center of gravity, its merchant marine. It was warfare reduced to an economic equation: sink ships faster than Japan can build them, and the empire will collapse. While submarines ravaged Japan's deepwater shipping, a new technological marvel was deployed to seal the coffin: the Boeing B-29 Superfortress. This was not just another bomber, it was the most advanced and expensive weapon of the entire war, featuring pressurized cabin, remote-controlled gun turrets, and a massive bomb load capacity. Initially used for high-altitude, precision daylight bombing of industrial targets with limited success, the B-29 found one of its most devastating roles under the command of General Curtis LeMay in a different, lower-altitude mission. One of LeMay's most brilliant and often overlooked initiatives was Operation Starvation, the aerial mining of Japan's inland waterways and ports, beginning in March 1945. B-29s, flying at night and at low level, dropped thousands of sophisticated magnetic and acoustic mines into the Shimonoseki Strait, the waters off Kobe, Osaka, and Tokyo, and other vital harbors. These mines were designed to be difficult to sweep, and they were devastatingly effective. The campaign, which required pinpoint accuracy, effectively shut down what little coastal shipping remained, the final artery for distributing what meager supplies trickled into the home islands. The B-29, a symbol of American industrial might, became the instrument that completed the blockade, proving that technological innovation could achieve what brute force alone could not. The blockade was not a single weapon, but a symphony of destruction conducted across different domains. Its effects rippled from the highest levels of command down to the individual soldier and civilian, revealing other critical angles of this catastrophic event. As the blockade tightened, a profound crisis of leadership and logistics unfolded within Imperial Japan. The Japanese military was notoriously factionalized, with the army and navy often acting as independent, rival fiefdoms competing for scarce resources. This dysfunctional structure prevented a unified, effective response to the shipping crisis. The navy, obsessed with the decisive fleet battle, was slow to prioritize convoy protection. When they finally established a convoy system in 1943, it was poorly organized and lacked sufficient escort vessels and air cover. The Japanese shipbuilding program, tasked with replacing lost tonnage, was crippled by a lack of steel, a direct result of the blockade itself. New ships were often built with inferior materials and rushed into service, only to be sunk on their maiden voyages. The leadership, trapped in a mindset of spiritual superiority, was slow to acknowledge the material reality of their situation. Reports of starvation in the army were often met with accusations of weak morale rather than calls for logistical reform. This institutional failure to adapt, to prioritize merchant shipping, and to confront the grim arithmetic of attrition was a critical self-inflicted wound. The very command structure that had enabled rapid conquest now accelerated the empire's implosion. For the common Japanese soldier stationed in the far-flung outposts of the empire, the blockade transformed a war of imperial glory into a desperate fight for survival. On islands like Rabaul, Truk, and Guadalcanal, entire armies were effectively written off, left to wither on the vine as the American island-hopping campaign bypassed them. These were not defeated in battle, they were besieged by an empty ocean. Letters and diaries from these soldiers chart a heartbreaking descent. In 1942, they wrote of victory and confidence. By 1943, concerns about supplies began to appear. By 1944 and 1945, the writings are dominated by a single, all-consuming theme: hunger. They describe scouring the jungle for anything edible: snakes, rats, insects, and toxic plants. They record the slow, agonizing erosion of their physical strength, their bodies consuming themselves. Scurvy, beriberi, and malaria ran rampant. The proud infantryman, who once saw himself as the embodiment of Yamato Damashii, was reduced to a skeletal figure, his spirit broken not by combat but by starvation. The very endurance he boasted of became a curse, prolonging his suffering in a hopeless situation. The blockade did not stop at the water's edge. Its effects washed over the entire Japanese homeland, with the merchant fleet decimated and coastal shipping paralyzed. By mines, the flow of raw materials to factories and food to cities slowed to a trickle. By early 1945, Japan's industrial production was in freefall. Aircraft factories stood idle for lack of aluminum and gasoline. The once proud Imperial Navy was reduced to a fleet, being its mighty battleships like the Yamato, immobilized at Kure for lack of fuel. Most devastating was the food shortage. Rice imports from Korea and Southeast Asia were cut by over 90%. The government implemented draconian rationing, but the rations themselves became almost meaningless, often consisting of a few hundred grams of millet or sweet potato per day. Urban civilians were forced to trade their belongings for black market food or to embark on long, futile trips to the countryside. Malnutrition became universal, stunting the growth of children and weakening the population ahead of the anticipated invasion. The American blockade had successfully brought the war home to every Japanese citizen, turning the home islands into a starving, beleaguered fortress long before a single American soldier set foot on its soil. The battlefield was now the national dinner table. The year 1944 marked the irreversible tipping point. The noose, which had been steadily tightening, now began to choke the life out of the Japanese Empire. The turning point was not a single day or battle, but a cascade of interlocking disasters that shattered the nation's capacity to wage war. The first and most critical blow was the American capture of the Mariana Islands, Saipan, Guam, and Tinian in the summer of 1944. The fall of Saipan in July, after brutal 3-week battle that cost nearly 30,000 Japanese soldiers their lives and drove thousands of civilians to suicide, was a strategic and psychological earthquake. For the first time, the Japanese homeland was within operational range of the new B-29 superfortress. The loss was so profound that it led to the collapse of Prime Minister Hideki Tojo's government. But beyond the psychological shock the Marianas provided, the U.S., with the anchor for its Central Pacific strategy, deepwater ports and vast airfields from which the final phase of the blockade could be launched. From these new bases, the American submarine fleet's campaign reached its murderous zenith. The statistics tell a stark story. In 1942, U.S. submarines sank 612,000 tons of Japanese shipping. In 1943, that figure rose to 1.8 million tons, but in 1944 it exploded to a catastrophic 3.8 million tons. American codebreakers having cracked the Japanese. Naval codes could now vector submarine wolfpacks directly onto the paths of major convoys. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, not only crippled Japanese naval air power, but also further distracted the Imperial Japanese Navy from its convoy protection duties. The sea lanes became a shooting gallery. The impact was immediate and catastrophic for Japan's fuel situation. Tankers were prioritized targets, and by late 1944, the flow of oil from the East Indies had been reduced to a negligible trickle. The Great Fleet, once the terror of the Pacific, was now Ghost Armada rusting at its anchors. The October 1944 Battle of Leyte Gulf, the largest naval battle in history, was in many ways a desperate, last-gasp sortie by a navy already running on fumes. The subsequent destruction of much of Japan's remaining surface fleet in this engagement meant there was no longer any meaningful naval force left to challenge American dominance of the sea lanes or protect what little merchant shipping remained. The empire was bleeding to death, its vital resources spilling into the deep blue of the Pacific. The first part of the climax has established the capture of the Marianas as the pivotal moment and detailed the submarine campaign's devastating peak in 1944. The strategic initiative now lay completely in American hands. By 1945, the war for Japan was no longer about victory, but about survival. The blockade had evolved from a strategic hindrance into an existential threat, systematically dismantling the nation's economy and society. The final acts of this drama were marked by a terrifying efficiency. The most devastating single blow to Japan's remaining lifelines was Operation Starvation, initiated on March 27, 1945. This campaign of aerial mining, conducted by B-29s under General Curtis LeMay's XXI Bomber Command, was a masterpiece of economic targeting. The B-29s, flying 1,500 sorties, dropped over 12,000 mines into Japan's key strategic waterways, particularly the Shimonoseki Strait, which connected the industrial heartland to the resources of the Asian continent. These were not simple contact mines. They were sophisticated magnetic and acoustic devices set to specific sensitivity levels to confound Japanese minesweeping efforts, which were primitive and easily overwhelmed. The results were instantaneous and staggering. The Shimonoseki Strait was effectively closed. The port of Kobe, one of the nation's largest, saw its shipping volume drop by 85%. Osaka's dropped by 90%. Coastal traffic, the final desperate method of moving what little food and coal remained between the home islands, virtually ceased. Ships trying to run the blockade faced a terrible choice: risk the mined inland sea or venture into the open ocean, where American submarines patrolled with near impunity. The Japanese economy entered a state of total seizure. Factories shut down, munitions production plummeted. The distribution system for food, already crippled completely, broke down. On the bypassed islands, the situation reached its grim conclusion. On New Britain, Sergeant Agawa and the 140,000-strong 17th Army were living ghosts. Official military rations had long since vanished. The jungle, once a source of tactical cover, was now a desperate larder. They hunted anything that moved. They boiled and ate there. Leather equipment, disease ran unchecked through their malnourished ranks. Their endurance, so fiercely boasted of, had become a slow-motion death sentence. Similar scenes played out across the Pacific, from the Solomons to the Dutch East Indies. These soldiers were not defeated by arms. They were defeated by an empty sea. The Imperial Japanese Army, a force of millions, was being systematically starved into impotence. Its strength sapped not by bullets, but by a profound and inescapable hunger. The turning point was not a moment of dramatic combat, but the silent, final closure of every port. The last failed voyage of the last supply ship. The battle was over. The siege had been won. The surrender of Japan in August 1945, brought about by the atomic bombs and the Soviet declaration of war, ended the fighting but could not immediately halt the consequences of the blockade. The aftermath revealed a nation and an empire shattered not just by firepower but by famine. When American occupation forces landed in Japan in late August and September 1945, they encountered a scene that shocked even battle-hardened veterans. The cities were burned-out shells, but the people were the true testament to the blockade's effectiveness. The average citizen was severely malnourished. A 1946 U.S. strategic bombing survey report noted that the average caloric intake for urban Japanese had fallen to a mere 1,680 calories per day by the war's end, well below the level required for sustained manual labor. The physical stature of the population had visibly diminished. People were thin, listless, and showed clear signs of vitamin deficiency diseases. The Japanese government itself estimated that 10 million of its people were on the brink of starvation in the immediate post-surrender period, requiring the victorious Americans to organize a massive food relief program to prevent a catastrophic peacetime famine. For the millions of Japanese soldiers stationed overseas, the surrender did not mean an immediate return home. They became prisoners of war, and their condition was often far worse. Allied troops liberating camps in Singapore, the Dutch East Indies, and the bypassed Pacific Islands discovered scenes of horror. In some camps, the death toll from starvation and disease had reached 50% or higher. On the island of New Britain, Sergeant Agawa's unit, what was left of it, emerged from the jungle as living skeletons. The official statistics are staggering. Of the approximately 1.74 million Japanese military personnel who died during the war, the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey estimated that as many as 1 million perished from illness and starvation, a direct result of the blockade and the military's failure to supply its troops. This number likely exceeds all American combat losses in the entire Pacific theater. The material cost was equally astronomical. Japan's merchant marine, which had totaled over 6 million tons at the start of the war, was reduced to a mere handful of seaworthy vessels totaling less than 500,000 tons. The U.S. submarine force was responsible for the destruction of 1,113 merchant ships, totaling 4.8 million tons, over 55% of all Japanese merchant shipping lost. When combined with losses from aircraft and surface ships, the total tonnage sunk reached 8.9 million tons. Japan's industrial capacity was eviscerated. Its economy had been systematically bombed, blockaded, and starved into utter ruin. The nation that had boasted of a co-prosperity sphere spanning half the globe was now a smoldering, starving, and occupied country. Beyond the stark numbers of tons sunk and calories lost, the blockade precipitated a profound strategic and psychological reckoning that would shape Japan for decades to come. It had demonstrated with brutal finality the limits of spiritual faith in the face of industrial and logistical supremacy. The United States Strategic Bombing Survey, conducted immediately after the war, delivered the definitive historical verdict. Its report on the war against Japanese shipping concluded with unambiguous force: the war against shipping was the most decisive single factor in the collapse of the Japanese economy and the logistic support of the Japanese military forces. It stated that even without the atomic bombs, without the conventional firebombing, and without the planned invasion, the blockade alone would have forced Japan's surrender. Likely before the end of 1945, the nation was prostrate, its ability to resist completely broken from within. The atomic bombs provided a shocking, catastrophic catalyst for a surrender that was already inevitable. For the Imperial Japanese military, the blockade was a humiliating repudiation of its core doctrines. The belief in Yamato Damasha had proven to be a tragic fallacy. No amount of spiritual endurance could manufacture calories, fuel, or bullets. The code of Bushido, which glorified death in battle, had offered no solution to death by starvation. The institutional arrogance that led to the neglect of convoy warfare and logistics was now exposed as a fatal flaw. The Japanese soldier, trained to die for the emperor, had instead been left to die by the neglect of his own command structure. This legacy of logistical failure would deeply influence post-war Japan's pacifist constitution and its focus on economic rather than military power. Perhaps the most chilling testimony comes from the highest levels of the defeated Empire Prince Fumimaro Kano, a former prime minister, stated before his death that the collapse of Japan's shipping and the resulting food crisis were more significant in bringing about surrender than the air raids. Even more telling was the admission from the chief of the Navy General Staff, Admiral Somu Toyoda, at the post-war Tokyo trials. When asked about the primary cause of Japan's defeat, he did not cite the atomic bombs, the loss of key battles, or the Soviet invasion. He stated simply, the sinking of merchant tonnage. I think that was the main cause of our defeat. It was the ultimate validation of the American strategy. The boast of endurance had been silenced, not by a greater spirit, but by the silent sinking of steel into the abyss until the nation itself was left with nothing but hollow pride and an empty stomach. The story of the U.S. Navy's blockade of Japan is more than a historical account of sunk tonnage and strategic plans. It is a sobering lesson on the true nature of modern warfare, where the front lines are not only drawn on maps, but etched into the economic and biological reality of a nation. It reveals a fundamental truth, that the will to fight, no matter how fervent, is a finite resource. It is dependent on the mundane, unheroic foundations of food, fuel, and supply. The Japanese soldiers' endurance was real, a formidable force born of culture and discipline, but it was ultimately a moral quality, pitted against an amoral physical fact. A man can resolve to fight on an empty stomach, but he cannot do so indefinitely. His body will, in the end, betray his spirit. The blockade stands as a monument to the power of indirect strategy. It achieved what countless bloody island assaults could not: the systemic collapse of an enemy's capacity to wage war. It bypassed the fierce resistance, the fortified bunkers, and the bands charges, striking instead at the fragile web of tankers, freighters, and ports that sustained the entire imperial endeavor. It was a victory of intellect over instinct, of logistics over dogma. In the silent, rusting hulks at the bottom of the Pacific and in the faded memories of skeletal soldiers, we find a timeless reminder. In war, the spirit is essential, but it is not omnipotent. The most potent weapon is not always the one that makes the loudest explosion, but sometimes the one that enforces the quietest, most profound hunger. It is a lesson in the limits of human endurance and the relentless, unforgiving logic of the Seijo.